Hello, and welcome to another edition of Living in the Sprawl, Southern California's most adventurous podcast. My name is Jon Steinberg, your humble correspondent and host, sitting alongside my lovely and talented producer slash fiance, Lisa Lowe. And for this, our 8th episode, we're going to try to marry a couple of our collected interests. True crime and entertainment. Where does the line present itself? Is there a line? And if so, where and when is it crossed? Question mark. To examine the nexus of true crime and entertainment, of course, Southern California being the epicenter for the uncomfortable marriage of these two subjects, we're going to turn our attention to 10 documentary films that you can watch right now on various streaming services and tell you a little bit about the corresponding Southern California-based crimes that inspired them. The true crime extravaganza, bubble, I'm not exactly sure what word encompasses the enormous boon in popularity which the genre has undergone in the past 6 or 7 years, but its impact is absolutely undeniable. Netflix, Amazon Prime, Hulu, all of the streaming services are littered with true crime documentaries, films inspired by actual crimes. For some reason, and I'm not going to play armchair psychologist to try to figure out why, but Americans are enraptured by the subject of true crime. And in Southern California, we have more than our fair share of notorious crimes that maybe we'll examine in a future episode down the road. I didn't want this particular topic to get swept up in subjects that have already been covered to death. O.J. Simpson, Robert Blake, Phil Spector. These are individuals that you have undoubtedly heard about a great deal, and thus they will not be included on today's program. We're going to be examining some cases that are a little bit less public and widely known, and the documentaries that have been produced that will help you to immerse yourself within the world of these sordid, true tales. So, we're going to start at number 10 in Oxnard, California. Strawberries and the summer residents of the Dallas Cowboys for their training camp, and not a great deal else. But number 10, in Oxnard, the events which inspired the 2013 documentary Valentine Road unfolded. For it was here, in the year of our Lord 2008, when 15-year-old Lawrence Larry King was gunned down by his classmate Brendan McInerney in a computer class on the campus of E.O. Green Middle School. King had come out as a homosexual, and this was, without a doubt, one of the saddest. Every hate crime is sad. I'm not here to rank them. But this event, which galvanized many, not only in the Oxnard community, but in Ventura County, and this case actually gathered quite a bit of recognition across the country in mainstream circles. So after the murder, there was quite a bit of legal wrangling, and if you're interested, the court documents on the trials of Brendan McInerney are quite fascinating. Ultimately, he was sentenced to 31 years in prison, where he sits currently. And the Valentine Road documentary that you can find on HBO Max, and all its related outlets, which are just those two, is fairly heartbreaking. Not much more to say aside from that. This is the kind of story that reminds us why we have begun including identity education in schools in the 21st century. For those of you with, let's say, right-wing friends, family, I know that I have some, show them this documentary and explain, okay, I know you think it's unnecessary for us to be promoting fill-in-the-blank agenda in school, but young people do need an education on matters of gender and identity, and this is the type of case that should be taught in schools around the country. And a good start to learn more about it is to watch the documentary Valentine Road. So, 10 Valentine Road in Oxnard, California. At number 9, we recommend the documentary Not Carol, which can be found on both Starz and Hulu, and details the tragic story of Carol Coronado, who in the year 2014 murdered her 3 young daughters, who were all under the age of 5, in the back unit of a residential home in Torrance. So, a bit of a different excursion into the city of Torrance than last week's. This story deals in large part with postpartum depression. There are certainly some socioeconomic issues at play, and the documentary does a tremendous job of spotlighting this subject, which I frankly had very little knowledge of. Moreover, when dealing in true crime, for those of you that have listened to Serial or My Favorite Murder, or you've watched Making a Murderer, or any of the innumerable forays into the dark and sordid world of true crime, you have, I'm sure, heard someone being interviewed from a smaller town who says the following: things like this don't happen here. The case of Carol Coronado, who is now serving 3 consecutive life sentences for the murder of her 3 small children, informs us that indeed, yeah, it can. It can absolutely happen anywhere. In Los Angeles, be it Beverly Hills, Encino, Westlake, kind of doesn't matter. I have huge lists of crimes that have occurred in every corner of the city, from gated communities to homeless encampments. And what happened on May 20th, 2014, on a residential street in Torrance, when a distraught, completely overwhelmed young mother of 3 decided to take the lives of her children, lets all of us know that it can happen anywhere. Not Carol is hard to watch at times, for sure. And to be honest with you, I put this on for my fiance and her sister maybe 5 weeks ago or so. And the very next day, there was a story that might be covered on a future episode of Living in the Sprawl that happened maybe 6 miles from where I'm sitting now, where a mother in Reseda did the same thing, killed her 3 children, and I'm not sure if that was postpartum related or what the cause of that incident happened to be. But again, with the notion that this can happen anywhere, watch Not Carol and ask yourself, could this be my neighbor? Could this be somebody who lives around the block? Yeah, absolutely. 9, Not Carol in Torrance. Number 8, we take a look at the satanic panic epidemic that enveloped the nation, and in particular Southern California in the 1980s, by traveling to Bakersfield, where we look at a case that is known broadly as the Kern County child abuse sex scandal. And this happened in 1982. The documentary where you can learn about the case is called Witch Hunt. You can rent it on Amazon for, I believe, $2.99. It's narrated by Sean Penn. It came out in 2009, and it delves deep into the horrifying case of more than 60 individuals in the Bakersfield area who were swept up in what can best be described as mass hysteria, in conjunction with the McMartin case, which is Manhattan Beach, and might be covered in a future episode, and a number of other ones in surrounding different states. The 1980s were seemingly a hotbed for fear of babysitters, daycare centers, the people who were watching our kids. Have you seen Capturing the Freedmans? We're not going to cover that here because it didn't occur in Southern California. But in that case, it was a computer class instructor. In Bakersfield, though, in 1982, a number of children came for, and by children, I mean under the age of 7 years old, accused parents and other members of the community of sexual abuse and other varied satanic acts. I'll let you infer what those might be. I'm not going to list the gory details here. And ultimately, 35 of the 37 individuals who were convicted on charges stemming from the abuse claims were exonerated. A few of the children, as grown adults, came into court in the early 2000s and testified that they hadn't been telling the truth as children, that they'd been trying to placate the psychologists and therapists who were hammering them with questions they didn't want to answer for long periods of time. In short, a whole horde of folks from Bakersfield were thoroughly railroaded by prosecutor Ed Jagels and his cohorts in the Kern County District Attorney's Office. Sean Penn does a magnificent job of narrating this story, and though this particular saga isn't quite as well known as the McMartin one, it has every bit the maddening flurry of information that was held by that case. And if you do watch this documentary, I can promise you, you will be infuriated, and I am right there with you. So, number 8, Bakersfield Witch Hunt. Number 7, we head eastward over to Riverside, where we settle in and watch the 2021 Netflix documentary, Why Did You Kill Me? The documentary tells the story of a mother's quest for justice in the slaying of her 24-year-old daughter, Crystal Theobald. The documentary plays a bit like a whodunit, not necessarily an Agatha Christie tale, but there is a let's catch this person element to the whole production, as Crystal's bereaved mother, Belinda, poses as a young woman interested in love, in quotation marks, on MySpace. The crime happened on February 24th, 2006 in Riverside, as I mentioned, and the story involves some gang activity, some reckless behavior, and the whole saga feels so unnecessary. I'm not trying to say that any murder is necessary, but this killing seems particularly capricious, fickle. There was absolutely no reason for it. And the documentary does a stellar job of taking us with Crystal's mother, Belinda, as she searches for her daughter's killer. Ultimately, she is successful, and there's a little bit of an unreliable narrator at play in the documentary, as we do learn some things about Belinda that color the way in which we see her as the story progresses. But Netflix knows how to make a documentary. Since 2013, 2014, they have consistently produced and released effective documentary stories that, while not necessarily to the caliber of HBO productions, are getting closer and closer with each passing year. So the world of Riverside, San Bernardino gangs and some of their activities, the members of these gangs, and the havoc that they decided to cause in their respective communities, all of which was completely foreign and unbeknownst to me, is spotlighted in this documentary to great effect. And I think it is certainly worth your time. So at number 7, we suggest you watch Why Did You Kill Me on Netflix. At number 6, Cult of Cults, a thorough examination of the infamous events that led to the mass suicide from the religious group, nay, cult, known as Heaven's Gate. You can watch this on HBO Max. It's 4 parts, so it's a bit longer than some of the other documentaries because it's a multi-parter. And I was reluctant to put this particular case on this list, but this is a really terrific docuseries. And I was so fascinated to learn that the mass suicide took place in a gated community in Rancho Santa Fe. So for the uninitiated, Heaven's Gate was a particular religious sect, I'll say, with a host of different kinds of views that brought in UFOs and past and future lives. I don't want to throw dirt on the dead, so I won't insult the group, but their end happened on March 26, 1997, when 39 members of the group committed mass suicide. For those of you familiar with Jonestown, certainly the most famous case of cult-inspired mass suicide, that happened in French-controlled Guyana, and the disparity between that location and the one in which the mass suicide by the members of Heaven's Gate took place is quite startling. Rancho Santa Fe is where Kawhi Leonard lives. It's Drew Brees, Phillip Rivers, the creme de la creme of San Diego sports entertainment. It's got a lot of Mulholland Drive, Bel Air-ish vibes to it. And the members of Heaven's Gate were simply renting a house within the Rancho Santa Fe gated community, but certainly a different setting than the weird, sprawling compound in French Guyana, which served as the host location for the People's Temple. Yeah, this is a famous case. If you're making jokes about it in a mainstream Amy Schumer, Judd Apatow comedy, then chances are a lot of people are familiar with the events of Heaven's Gate. And yet, it's this HBO Max documentary that I think does a spectacular job of telling us the story, placing us with the family members of some of the group participants who took their own lives on that ill-fated day in 1997. And the more time spent trying to get inside the minds of a group such as this means more content and a better chance to truly understand the motives which propelled such over-the-top act as was the final choice that was made by the 39 members of the Heaven's Gate. Rancho Santa Fe, Cult of Cults, at number 6. Number 5, another Netflix entry, albeit a much shorter one. This is Long Shot, which concerns the murder of Martha Puebla in 2003 in North Hollywood. But the documentary is about how the prime suspect in Martha's murder turned out to have been at a Los Angeles Dodgers game in the background of an episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm. So this documentary includes interviews with Larry David and other members of the Curb Your Enthusiasm production team in this completely unbelievable story of justice via the most unlikely source imaginable. Juan Catalan was the brother of someone identified by Martha Puebla in court for another shooting that had taken place in the North Hollywood area. So detectives surmised that, well, surely it must have been Juan Catalan. He was avenging his brother. This girl testified against his brother, and snitches are persona non grata in these circles. And yet, as it turned out, Juan Catalan was actually at the Dodgers game in the nosebleed section, sitting near Larry David, as cameras were rolling on an episode in which LD had decided to pick up a sex worker in order to use the carpool lane on their way to the Dodgers game. Using footage from the show's taping, prosecutors were able to see that Catalan was in fact at the Dodgers game, making the case for him as Martha Puebla's murderer impossible. Too wild to be true, and yet it was. Number 5, Long Shot, by way of Larry David and the Curb Your Enthusiasm crew. Number 4, another in the too preposterous to be true and yet it was category, My Friend Rockefeller. The documentary came out in 2015, telling the improbable, and that word doesn't even begin to encapsulate the incredulity of the actual case. But the documentary tells the vast story of con man Christopher Gerhardschreider. I listened to the book, The Man in the Rockefeller Suit, and yet it took me practicing pronouncing that name 3 times to get it right. 9 hours worth of hearing that name, and yet it still was almost impossible for me to pronounce. In any event, Christopher Gerhardschreider was a German immigrant who came to the United States in the 1980s, at first posing as a foreign exchange student on the East Coast before making his way westward to the upper echelon Eastern Los Angeles society, posing as a British member of the aristocracy. Gerhardschreider engineered his way into the hearts and minds of San Marino's elderly female residents. He started going to church multiple times a week, every single weekend, and using his connections to catapult him into reality that no one was ever quite sure actually existed. After multiple identity changes, 2 blown marriages, and a newsworthy child abduction, Gerhard Schreider was arrested in 2008, and it was only then that the extent of some of his crimes came to the surface. And really, it actually took quite a while for his deeds in San Marino to be uncovered and for him to be prosecuted to the full extent of the law as a result. So, as I mentioned, Gerhard Schreider in the 80s, this is before he was a Rockefeller, this was before he had a young daughter, this was before he lived on the East Coast. So, a 20-something young German gentleman posing as a member of the British aristocracy gets in good with the church ladies in San Marino and winds up living at an elderly widow's guest house. Over the course of time, the widow became more and more dependent on alcohol and less in touch with the actual world. Her son and his wife went missing, and after a while, so did her British, in quotation marks, house guest. As it turned out, the house guest had killed her son and his wife and fled California in a pickup truck belonging to a deceased person. Gerhard Schreider now sits in San Quentin State Prison, where he will remain for the rest of his natural life. But the documentary in question, My Friend Rockefeller, spins quite a yarn detailing the decades of con artistry committed by Gerhard Schreider. If it weren't so preposterous, it wouldn't be possible. The bigger the lie, the easier it will be to accept it, was the gentleman's mantra. And if you detach yourself from the fact that he committed multiple murders, there is a curious person, who's kind of in awe of Gerhard Schreider and the evil that he was able to get away with. The fact that he was able to trick hundreds upon thousands of people from coast to coast using multiple identities over the course of 3 to 4 decades. How one person from a small town in Europe got away with all this, it's a story for the ages, and that's why it's here at number 4 on Living in the Sprawl's list of true crimes in Southern California and the documentaries that help immerse you in their stories. Number 3, we head down to San Diego, taking a look at the deaths at Spreckles Mansion from 2011. This is a case that did receive quite a bit of attention when it happened and in the subsequent years, most notably in the investigation discovery, Death at the Mansion, a 4-part docuseries delving into the events at the property on Coronado in San Diego in the year 2011. For those that do not know the basics of the story, a young woman married to a pharmaceutical millionaire was caring for his 6-year-old son when he was out of town. Something happened and his son fell, ultimately to his death. And in the aftermath of the 6-year-old's passing, Rebecca Zahow was found on the property hanging. Officially, the death of Zahow was deemed a suicide at the beginning, but that has been called into question in subsequent years. This documentary, and I was hesitant to give Discovery ID, a shout out here, because I don't love a lot of what they do. And they seem kind of like the offspring of Anne Rule in almost glamorizing some of the horrible crimes and occurrences that they document on the channel. And yet it was honestly the presence of Billy Jensen, who some may know from his various podcasting endeavors and his appearance on one in particular with Paul Holes detailing the capture of the Golden State Killer. It was his participation in the documentary that pushed me into watching it. And I'm glad I did. It did air on Discovery ID and offers a non-exploitative look into the events at Spreckles Mansion. And this is a fascinating crime. The property is not in a gated community. It's literally around the corner from Hotel del Coronado, which was a topic of a previous episode in relation to Some Like It Hot. And there's a great deal of debate afoot here. Many people go with the official story that Zahau, distraught over her perceived role in the death of her husband's 6-year-old son, did in fact take her own life. A lot of people believe that. And yet others believe that her brother-in-law had something to do with it by virtue of the way in which the knots were tied with the rope that she was hanging from. No matter what side of the debate you fall into, this is an utterly fascinating examination of the events. And even though I don't endorse most of what airs on Investigation Discovery, I will put my stamp of approval on this one and tell you to watch Death at the Mansion, which took place in Coronado, the jewel of San Diego. For number 2, The Trials of Gabriel Fernandez, a docuseries, again, brought to us by the good folks at Netflix. The documentary details the appalling murder of 8-year-old Gabriel Fernandez in the city of Palmdale at the hands of his mother, Pearl, and her boyfriend. The event on which the documentary is based took place on May 22nd, 2013, and is one of the most devastating examples of child abuse you are ever going to find captured in a documentary. If you've ever read Flowers in the Attic or A Child Called It, anything along those lines, you will be familiar with this kind of a story. And yet, when you watch the documentary and you see the extent of barbarity on display in 2013, there's something downright sickening about all of it. Child Protective Services get dragged through the mud in this one. Obviously, Gabriel's mother/murderer. No one comes out looking splendid at the end of this docuseries. This was the first thing that I watched when the world went into lockdown in the spring of 2020, and it has stayed with me and will continue to stay with me. Every time I drive in the direction of Palmdale or past Palmdale, I can't help but think of the apartment complex where an 8-year-old was being tortured by his mother and her boyfriend. Neighbors, classmates, teachers, people had their suspicions, but no one knew for certain. And when a parent, and in particular a mother, is the one committing the violence, it's all the more awful and hard to believe. This is not one to watch in the spirit of My Favorite Murder or Small Town Murder or any of the forms of media which attempt to add a degree of levity to the proceedings. This is about as sober as it gets when it comes to the subject, and so it was in Palmdale. Oh, Palmdale's not all bad. It is the home of LA Clippers 7-time All-Star guard Paul George, so there have been some good things that have come out of Palmdale. I don't want to totally diss on the city, but it was in Palmdale, roughly 70 miles north of Los Angeles proper, where the events in the docuseries, The Trial of Gabriel Fernandez, took place. And finally, at number 1 on today's topic, we go to a few places within our purview a couple of cities, regions, areas, as we watch HBO's enthralling docuseries, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, chronicling the Golden State Killer, his crimes, and his eventual capture. Now, I remember reading Michelle McNamara's book before one of the most prolific and most horrible human beings in the history of the world was apprehended. And the day on which Joseph James DeAngelo was arrested and news of his capture hit mainstream press outlets, I couldn't believe it. This was one of those crimes that I thought was going to go the way of Jack the Ripper. We would never know. It would go the way of Zodiac. We might have suspicions. Ultimately, we might have some highly educated guesses as to the identity of the culprit. But I never thought we would actually witness the arrest, conviction, and now imprisonment of the Golden State Killer. The whole dramatic series of events which led to the capture of Joseph James DeAngelo, his identity, identification, everything involved with this case goes in the all-timer folder. From Dana Point to Ventura, Goleta, Irvine, this man was an absolute menace, terrorizing the entire state from north to south. The East Area Rapist portion of his crimes pretty much all occurred in Sacramento and Northern California, but all of the murders happened in Southern California. And I've driven to all of these places where houses still stand, and you can see perhaps why the homes were targeted, each kind of having outlets to freeways or escape routes by which he could flee the scene. And when you take the totality of this guy's crimes and misdemeanors into question, I put his actions up against really any serial killer, any non-political leader, mass murderer in the last 200 years. And when he was captured, this is one of my favorite details, when he was apprehended at his home in Sacramento, he told the arresting officers, "I have a roast on." He had a pot roast in the oven. Can't get better than that. And so it goes, and so we recommend I'll Be Gone in the Dark, a tribute to Michelle McNamara, Paul Holes, and all the men and women responsible for capturing this wicked beast of a human being. And that does it for today's episode of Living in the Sprawl. We thank you for your continued support and engagement with the show. The social media, you can find us on Instagram at Living in the Sprawl Podcast. Please go ahead, write us and email us at livinginthesprawlpodcast@gmail.com. Again, we are interested in your comments. Your feedback is invaluable. Questions, suggestions for topics that you would like for us to address in forthcoming episodes. And I will go ahead and steal a bit from the dudes at Small Town Murder and Crime and Sports by urging any and all of you to hop on Apple, give us a review, give us 5 stars. It does drive a podcast up the charts. It does kind of serve as a lifeblood for a burgeoning podcast, as this one is, and your support is greatly appreciated. So on behalf of my beautiful, lovely, and talented producer / fiance, Lisa Lowe, I am your humble host and correspondent, Jon Steinberg, thanking you for listening to another episode of Living in the Sprawl, Southern California's most adventurous podcast.